Good morning, gamers, and hello, YouTube. I'm gonna go back to basics today because, hey, this is DnDaily number 101, so let's talk like Dungeons & Dragons 101, or RPG 101 if you prefer. Hi there, I'm Gregory. Welcome if this is your first time watching one of my videos. Hey, this is 1 in 20 D&D, where I do a daily vlog that we talk about Dungeons & Dragons mostly, but also other RPGs and tabletop gaming in general. So today I'm going to talk about basics. And what do I mean about basics? Basics, for sure, I want to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about the basics of the player as what is important for you to know when you sit down at the table. And then I'm going to talk about the basics in the sense of everyone, whether you're a DM or a player, in how you can use what's called the beginner's mind in your approach to playing Dungeons & Dragons. So let's get started right here. Let's talk about basics. Now, this is going to be a very general, surface level. I'm not going to get into details. I just want to give you concepts so you understand, if you're a new player, an approach you can take to playing your character. Now, if you are an advanced player, this still applies, because I've seen plenty of advanced players who still make some of these mistakes. Maybe you've played for years, but you haven't played a certain class. Listen to this. Here's my first tip. When you decide what class you're playing, when you decide what class you're playing, I want you to focus in on two things: your class and your role, okay? Your class is going to determine the type of play you are going to do. And what I mean by that is, are you going to use weapons? Are you going to use magic? Or are you going to be and within those two distinctions, are you going to be in close or are you going to be far away? And it may change, okay? Sometimes you may be right next to your opponent, sometimes you might be far away from your opponent. Melee versus ranged. That's important to understand, but let's take a fighter that is a melee fighter. What is a melee fighter's most important thing to know? Armor class, the attack roll, and your damage dice for your weapon. That's the basics of your class. That's what you need to understand. All the other stuff, saving throws, hit points, hit dice, this and that, a lot of that is important, and you want to know what your class features are, your second wind and your action surge and these kind of things. But let's talk about the basics. The basics for a melee fighter are simply armor class, attack bonus, and damage. That's what you need to focus in on as a melee fighter. Now let's flip the switch. Let's say you are a ranged magic user. You're a magic user who wants to stand in the back and cast spells. You have to understand two things. You need to understand your attacks as a magic user, which are slightly different than attacks as a fighter, monk, barbarian, etc. So as a magic user, whether it's a wizard or a cleric, a bard, what have you, you need to understand how your magical attacks work, and you need to understand DC, which is difficulty class. So you have a DC rating based on your ability scores. That's important because that's what the DM or your enemies are going to try to resist. It's like the power of your spells, your attack bonus and your DC. That's on the offensive side. Now, the other thing a spellcaster should focus on is this: the basics of spells, range, and casting time. Those are the two basic things you need to understand about spells. Duration also applies, so those things are good. Think about those before the game and study those just a little bit before the game so that you know when you're playing ahead of time sort of how things work, and then you have your reference cards or your character sheet or your handbook to actually look it up on the spot if you need all the details. The last thing I'm going to say for this part of this video, the basics, is also for spellcasters. I think one of the most important things to understand for spellcasters is concentration. If you don't understand how concentration works, please spend some time figuring it out. This is one of the things that I see that lots of people get confused by and make mistakes about. It's easy to forget, it's easy to overlook, it's easy to mix it up in the heat of the game. So understanding it ahead of time will really help you. So that's all I'm going to say about the basics. I just want to cover it on a surface level. Understand your class, think about what your primary role is in your class, and then really focus in on understanding the elements of that role. That's the basics of your class. That's the basics of playing the game. All the other stuff you can figure out at the table. And then ultimately tell a good story above all else. Now, the other thing I'm going to share with you is this, and this applies to everyone. Okay? So this applies to a DM, this applies to a brand new player, and this applies to people like me who maybe you are like me, you've been playing for years and years, and you've got lots of experience with lots of different editions or many different game systems. Perhaps you've heard of the phrase or the term, the beginner's mind, okay? Or imagine like being a white belt, if you will. Perhaps you've heard the tale, the phrase, or the what's the word I want to use? The allegory, the story about the student and the master. And the student comes to the master with all kinds of questions. Question after question after question. And the master just sits there quietly, not answering. And finally, the student gets frustrated and says, "Master, why won't you answer my questions?" And the master looks at this. He starts to pour tea, and he keeps pouring tea and pouring tea and pouring tea, and eventually the teacup overflows, and the student says, "Master, master, the teacup's overflowing." And the master puts down the tea kettle and says to the student, he says, "Like this tea kettle, your cup is already full. How can I answer your questions and share my wisdom with you if your cup is already full?" Now, I'm using my own version of that story. Perhaps you've heard it in a different way. I'd love to hear your version of that story. You could share that with me in the comments below. The point of this story is this. If you come to the game and think you got it all figured out, think you know everything, like I have to admit, sometimes I get into that mindset of like, yeah, I know how that works. Well, you know what? That's going to prevent you from learning and having fun at the table, because you might figure something new out. You might see a different perspective or a different way to approach things. And I'm going to pick a very specific example, one of my favorites that I see happening all the time in lots of different games. It's one of my favorite spells. It's called Polymorph. It got used on me last night. Perhaps you checked our stream last night on variant roles. Well, I had lots of fun playing variant roles, and I got polymorphed into a sheep because I failed my saving throw. That's a great way to use polymorph, a very typical way to use polymorph. You turn someone else, you turn your opponent, your enemy, into something harmless. That's one way to use polymorph. But there's other ways to use polymorph. You can use it as an offensive spell. Did you ever think perhaps you could give your fighter the form of a giant gorilla? Now they have a whole lot more hit points, and they can bash around as a giant gorilla for as long as the spell lasts, and it doesn't affect their hit points at all until they're back into their regular form. So you just boosted the hit points of your tank. Did you ever think about that? How about using polymorph as a spell that, you know, hey, we're stuck. There's this chasm in front of us. How are we going to get across to the other side? Well, you could polymorph yourself into a bird. A bird can fly across the chasm. You could polymorph yourself into a millipede, crawl down one side and crawl back up the other side, or a monkey, or something that has a great climbing ability. So that's 3 different ways one spell could be used. And if you only think of the spell being used in one way as an offensive spell to transform your enemies, you're missing out on all kinds of other fun with one spell. Now, that's just one example. I think if you try using the beginner's mind, you know, forget about everything you know to a point, approach each game with an open mind. What can I learn? What can I find out? What are the other players doing that I have never thought of doing before? Or what might I think of new and fresh in this game that I've never thought of before? You are going to have a lot of fun. So that's the basics. That's basics. Being a beginner when you're playing this game. It's a lot of fun to do. I hope you'll try it out. I also would love to see you at a game table someday. Until then, keep rolling 20s. Remember, it's your game. Play your way.